The site of Gobekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is one of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries of the last few decades. Just look at it. Its ceremonial core consists of a series of megalithic stone circles. Carved on the stones are a range of wild animals. Gobekli Tepe graces the cover of archaeology textbooks taught to all introductory archaeology students. It has sparked controversy as a lightning rod for fantastical pseudoarchaeology. From dinosaurs to aliens to Atlantis on YouTube and TikTok, or scholarly debates about the agricultural revolution, prehistoric monumentality, and the hunter-gatherer crisis. Occupied after the end of the last ice age, it truly is a marvelous site from thousands of years ago. To understand the cutting edge of what's happening at Gobekli Tepe, I caught up with Dr. Lee Clare, the excavation and research coordinator for the site, who works at the German Archaeological Institute. This is Archaeology with Flint Dibble. I'm Flint Dibble, and let's dive into the secrets of Gobekli Tepe for the next hour or so. It's a privilege. I'm here with Dr. Lee Clare of the German Archaeological Institute, and he's the field director at Gobekli Tepe. They're excavating right now, so we can get a sense of what's going on at the site that so many people are really interested in. So, Dr. Clare, do you mind first just telling us, how did you get involved with the excavations at Gobekli Tepe?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here. Yeah, I've been at the site now, or in the project, for about 10, 11 years, since 2013. I am a Neolithic archaeologist, so that's always been my sort of area of expertise, as it were, right from the very beginning, from when I was studying. I did my master's at the University of Cologne, and then my PhD followed on from that. And my PhD was looking at also late Neolithic and climate change and culture interaction. And after my PhD, I was lucky enough to get a position with Klaus Schmidt, who was at the time director of Göbekli Tepe in his project in Berlin. I moved to Berlin, and I've been there ever since. Of course, Klaus Schmidt passed away in 2014. So 10 years ago, and from that point in time, I sort of took on the organization of the field work and the research at the site, and yeah, that's 10 years ago now. So I've been there quite a while.
Okay, fantastic. So, you're the guy right now, in a sense, for thinking about this kind of stuff. So, all right, one of the things that I see in the media all the time that gets mentioned about Gobekli Tepe is that it just came out of nowhere and shocked archaeologists, and it rewrote history in a sense. What's your take on that kind of sensational narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't there at the time. I mean, I was a student, I think, in the mid 1990s when actually I started studying 1997. So excavations started in Göbekli in 1995. And I remember learning about it as a student. And of course, it was a topic that was covered in the lectures that were giving there, but very briefly, in fact, because of course, in the mid 1990s, late 1990s, not so much was known. The popularity of the site, I mean, the fact that it was something special, okay, I knew that from the very beginning when I was studying. But of course, that only became clear when I actually went to the site and saw the site myself. The site's obviously very important. It's the oldest monumental structure that we have. The reason it is so important is because of this sort of monumentality. The reason it's important is because of its age. Obviously, it wasn't expected to. Archaeologists weren't expecting hunter-gatherers to actually construct such a monument or such a building at the time, mid-1990s. Now we know, it's one of many sites, obviously, down there in southeastern Turkey. And of course, the hypothesis put forward by Klaus Schmidt at the time was, of course, that these monumental structures were sort of the world's first temples, and that it was the religion and the construction of these monumental buildings that actually led to domestication. because of course they had to provide the victuals and the provisions for all of these workmen to actually have time to free them from the hunting, to actually sort of construct them, which would have perhaps been a reason why they went towards more the domestication of animals and plants as a means of providing the victuals for the workforce. I don't agree with that anymore. I mean, that was something that I learned, as I said, but you know, since working at the site, it's become clear that this probably wasn't the case. I mean, religion is an important aspect of the site. But of course, we have to discuss interpretations of religion. What is religion? You know, when does it start? Do we have deities at the site? There are so many sort of perspectives you can sort of take on that. But the thing is, the problem with this hypothesis is simply that, you know, people have always had some sort of belief system. And not only that, the site, we still have absolutely no proof or no examples of domesticated species. So we have no domesticated animals, no domesticated crops. It's all wild grasses, wild animals. So that transition actually didn't happen at the site. So in other words, the site's a bit of a smoking gun for the Neolithic, but perhaps that isn't the case. You know, I don't think it is that, you know, it's part of a mechanism. And we're seeing that more and more now with the modern research.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, I'm a zooarchaeologist, so I've read up on some of the plants and the animals, and I mean, it's all wild wheat mainly, and then it's gazelle, right? That
That's
comes
right.
through.
Gazelle is the main
Yeah.
source of meat for the people down there. It was.
And then I mean, from my gathering, it seems like it's very seasonal that they're there. They're sort of the wild grasses would become available in the springtime, and the gazelle come through in the late summer. And
Yeah.
so, in a sense, it's sort of a seasonal area where people might come for 6 months, where there's a glut of food available.
That's right.
And so, very clever people. They know where to go for food,
They know
right?
what to do. And of course, you know, the thing is now we have this, you know, from our new research and also from sort of looking at the old interpretations and the old documentation from the excavations, we actually now realize that the site was not just this sort of, and that's very important because Klaus Schmidt always said the site was just a ritual site with no domestic activity. We know now that from the very beginning of a settlement, or from the very beginning of the sequence at Göbekli Tepe, people were settling there. And in the course of
Interesting.
the settlement phase, in the course of the site's history, that increased quite significantly. And I think by the end of the sequence, you know, we're looking at quite substantial village settlement at Göbekli Tepe.
Very, very cool. Let's get into that in a second, because that's some of your excavations that are showing that, right? The people who built Gobekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers living after the end of the last ice age. This simple fact, that such a phenomenal series of monuments were built by hunter-gatherers and not farmers, is one that I find regularly surprises people on the internet. Like these comments left on my earlier interview about Gobekli Tepe with Jens Notroff, people are incredulous. The only way to answer the interesting questions about who built Gobekli Tepe is through careful, methodical excavation. If we want to know whether these people were farmers or hunter-gatherers, that means we need to look at what kind of plants and animals they ate. To collect small animal bones and the stone tools that show how they were hunting or processing crops, it's important to sift all excavated sediment carefully through a sieve like this. This video shows sieving at a project I work for in Greece, the Neolithic site of Gurimadi, excavated by Žarko Tankosic of the Swedish School in Athens. This sort of sifting is standard procedure at archaeological projects focusing on Stone Age sites like Gobekli Tepe. It's the only way to collect tiny animal bone fragments, stone tools, or potsherds, although there are no potsherds from Gobekli Tepe. Sifting so much sediment is a real laborious, mind-numbing process. And they've discovered thousands of animal bones from Gobekli Tepe. And the animal bones from there are all from wild animals, mostly gazelle. And the careful collection of smaller teeth has provided a good sample with which zooarchaeologists can understand the season of death of these animals, when they were hunted. Most of these gazelle were hunted in the late summer or early autumn. the time in which they migrated through the nearby mountain pass. The Neolithic people at Gobekli Tepe were smart. They knew where and when to hunt this group of gazelle. Just as important as the bones are the seeds from plants. These are even more difficult for archaeologists to collect. To do so, a sample of sediment has to go through a flotation tank, like this one here used on the excavations of Vashtami in Albania. I built this tank with Professor Susan Allen, the director of the project, and used it for 2 summers to collect Stone Age seeds at this site. These were some of the earliest crop seeds ever found in Europe. At Gobekli Tepe, it's very important that the team take the time to do flotation. To float, sort, and analyze just 1 bucket of sediment can take several hours of skilled labor by those trained to process the samples and identify the broken, charred remains of seeds. The painstaking analysis done by the team at Gobekli Tepe has shocked people because all the seeds also come from wild plants, mostly wild wheat. So even though the first farmers were appearing nearby in the Middle East, domesticating wheat and other crops to farm and settle down, it's clear that the people at Gobekli Tepe were not farmers, but skilled hunter-gatherers who found a fertile niche of food, wild wheat to harvest in the spring and early summer, that they ground into gruel or fermented into beer, as well as the large seasonally migratory herd of gazelle nearby. A feast to sustain these people for over 1,000 years. So let's think about this date. You mentioned that it's very early. You sent me some slides with some radiocarbon.
Yeah, that show the radiocarbon date. I mean, what we can see here, this is a compilation of
It's
data.
complicated. You have a lot of evidence.
Well,
is the
it's
point.
not. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a simple. I say simple. It's a way of sort of visualizing the radiocarbon data from a number of sites in the region, not just at Göbekli Tepe. So we've got like the Tigris region, northern Iraq sites. We've got also the Turkish area of the Upper Tigris, the Upper Euphrates basin, of course, the Tepeler sites in Urfa. And I've just taken the radiocarbon data from all of these sites and plotted them as a sort of bar calibration. As it were. And at the bottom, we've got a few climate curves, which perhaps aren't of interest at the moment. So what you can see here, Göbekli Tepe is at the top here. And we've got dates also from, I've got dates here from 2 sites in the region, Nevali Chori at the top here, and Yeni Mahalle. There are 2 other Tepeler sites that we know of.
And just a quick note for everybody, Nevali Chori was found before Gobekli Tepe, right?
That's right.
And
yeah.
So in that sense, this is part of a trend of sites that have been discovered in the last 30, 40 years. And the excavation has been targeting them as Nevali Chori came up, then Gobekli Tepe, now Karahan Tepe, etc.
Yeah. I mean, Nevali Chori was the first site where they actually found a Tepeler.
Yeah.
And the so-called cult building that was excavated by Harald Hauptmann and his team. So a lot of German projects in this region. And after Nevali Chori, things moved on to Göbekli in the mid-1990s. So these are the radiocarbon data. So we see Nevali Chori is clearly sort of PPMB in date. We're in the 9th millennium BC here. And of course, Göbekli is a slightly earlier, starts already in the PPNA, so in the early Holocene, around the mid-10th millennium BC. And then we can see that in the context with other sites in the region. Of course, as I said, it's just one of many sites, and it just so happens that the sites in the Sanliurfa region are sites with these monumental limestone carved T-pillars. But of course, we have special buildings and communal structures in a lot of these sites that are here. You know, in a lot of the like Jaffa al-Ahmar, for example. I mean, there are lots of examples. Murebet. I mean, you could look at the literature and find lots of examples. But I say only in Göbekli and in the Tas Tepeler or the Sanliurfa sites, we have this sort of phenomenon of these limestone carved T-pillars.
Yeah.
But as you can see, you know, things kick off already, or things started already in the Epipaleolithic. I mean, there is evidence for, you know, a settlement or people living in the region way before Göbekli Tepe. It didn't really appear out of nothing. Of course, Göbekli Tepe and the region around Sanliurfa, we don't know too much about what was happening before, so in the Epipaleolithic. But I think that's the state of research. I think we can expect a lot more in that area.
And
Um,
that's the Natufian culture that you're thinking about earlier?
Natufian is further to the south, more the
Okay.
Levant. Although I think the northernmost site of the Natufian is, I think, somewhere in northern Syria. So I think we do have certain influences coming in from the south, but I think there are other influences also coming in from the east, from the Tigris
Ah.
region and from Iraq and Iran, that sort of area. So it's a bit of an area where a lot of things are colliding in a way at this time.
That makes a
Um,
lot of sense.
I think you see that quite a bit in the lithic. We've been looking at the lithics as well within the frame of the project, and we do see clear links towards the east and towards that sort of area. You can see actually that the
Oh.
whole Neolithic sort of this transition, and I think I should mention here that we're in the pre-pottery Neolithic, and the Neolithic is a very long development. In fact, it has lots of different parts to it. There's sedentism, there's the pottery that comes in later, there's secondary products, wool, milk, this sort of thing. It's all happening in the Neolithic, and that's one of the reasons I find the Neolithic so interesting. But we're in a period now, this is in this region, we're looking at quite a few thousand years. I mean, we have first sort of sedentary populations in sort of like southeastern Turkey in the Epipaleolithic.
Hmm.
But pottery doesn't come in until about 7,000 BC. So we're looking at thousands of years of development. And around the mid-9th millennium BC, then we have like the first domesticates coming in, like domesticated animals and plants. So it's a very long transition, and it's not something that happens overnight.
So mid-ninth. So basically, right as the occupation of Göbekli Tepe is ending, that's when sort of
That's
domesticated
when,
plants and animals show up in this
exactly.
area of Turkey. Okay, that's really interesting. So I have a question for you. Why is it called the Neolithic if there's no domesticates there?
I think we can always argue about terminology. I
Yeah.
mean, people have said proto-Neolithic before now. You know, Göbekli Tepe culture has been proposed in recent years. But I think Neolithic is just used because it implies this sort of we are becoming sedentary. We are starting to use resources that are perhaps in a certain sort of revere that we become stuck, or I say stuck, but we're looking more at territories that are fixed. That mobility is decreasing. So I think these are all important aspects, and this is something that I've often spoken about. That these people were very much, they were Homo sapiens like us.
Hmm.
There's no difference between us and them, just that they were born in quite a different time.
Yeah.
And cognitively speaking, they were quite different to us. I mean, of course, it didn't happen overnight, as I said, but they go from sort of really sort of mobile groups and populations, quite small, becoming sedentary and the population growing. And with that growth of population, you get lots of challenges coming in. Of course, you have how do you cope with all of these people? You have to have mechanisms to keep things going along. Who makes the decisions? What happens if you get surplus? Who's in charge of resources? You get incipient hierarchization of society that perhaps wasn't there before. And who are those guys that are doing this, or ladies? They have lots of challenges, lots of things going on at this time that they need to deal with. And I think one of the answers is perhaps these special buildings or these so-called temples we see at Göbekli Tepe.
I think that's a really good transition. Just this last week, you had an article come out on sort of inspired individuals and charismatic leaders, in a sense, and dealing with what in the region is called the hunter-gatherer crisis, right?
Yeah,
And
that's what I refer
so,
to it as, yeah.
yeah, and so in many ways, I think that that's what this is kind of talking to right here. This kind of is that what you see this enclosure as kind of representing the rise of these kind of charismatic leaders that
That's right.
deal with this kind of sedentism? I mean, from the perspective of people who, for generations, have moved with the food in a sense, right? All of a sudden to have to take that step to not move is kind of almost terrifying, right? You know, you're having faith there'll be enough food there to supply you, and then all of a sudden it's so successful that populations start booming. So do you want to walk us through some of this
Yeah, I
new
mean,
article?
yeah, I mean, what I've been looking at, and what I'm quite interested in. I mean, here you can see a map of the region. A lot of the sites that I just mentioned on those radiocarbon dated sites. You can see here, obviously, this is the Sanliurfa region with the so-called Tas Tepeler sites. So we got this is the close-up of that area. So here's Göbekli Tepe down here, and we've got Sanliurfa, the modern city here. We've got Karahan Tepe over here in the Tek Mountains. And these are all sort of T-pillar sites or related sites in, or pre-pottery Neolithic sites in this Sanliurfa region.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we have the northern Syrian sites along the Euphrates, and here the sites along the Tigris in northern Iraq and also in southeastern Turkey. Now, the thing is at these sites, and especially at Göbekli Tepe, is that we don't have any evidence for the hierarchies. We don't have any evidence for these sort of privileged people. And the question is why? I mean, we don't have any bigger houses. I mean, all the houses or domestic structures we have are more or less the same size. Of course, we have the special buildings. You could say that they were domestic, but we don't think that. You know, there's something special. They weren't domestic. They weren't being lived in, I don't think. We don't have any graves that are with more grave goods. In fact, we only have 2 graves at Göbekli Tepe at the moment. We have other burials from other sites that we can look at. There is perhaps a difference, a slight difference in some grave goods, but I don't think it's that clear. We can say there's the ruling class. So all of this sort of proof that we'd expect to have for an upper class or a hierarchy is not there. And the question is why? And I think the reason being is that they're very much still in the mindset of their Paleolithic past in a way. They're trying to uphold those more egalitarian sort of life ways, even though things are actually changing. And of course, they're looking to sort of certain individuals to sort of help them, or certain individuals may have sort of taken a decisive or a role as decision makers at certain times to actually keep things going and to provide some sort of stability at times of, you know, had to mitigate sort of conflict and various things and who was going where, etc., who was building what where. I mean, and I think that would have been down to sort of, you know, individuals that had some sort of influence over their peers in a way. And I think, you know, we're perhaps looking at sort of hunters or perhaps storytellers or shamans in a way. So people that had some sort of clout in society, perhaps through their skills as a hunter or as a storyteller or as a shaman, you know, a healer, or, you know, summoning the rains or whatever. I think these sort of people would have played a certain role in those societies. And I think they could have been sort of, say, upgraded to some sort of decision makers at certain periods when it was necessary, in fact.
And you think that these depictions of wild boars are sort of representative of that?
Yeah, I mean, the images that we have at Göbekli Tepe, I mean, of course, this is something very special we found last year.
Beautiful.
But a lot of the images, the imagery on the pillars, I mean, this isn't willy-nilly. This isn't sort of the guy went out and saw, you know, a boar and a crane and a fox and just sort of, I'm going to put that on a T-pillar. These are narratives that we're seeing. I mean, people knew exactly who they were depicting or what they were depicting, the stories they were depicting. And of course, the T-pillars themselves are actually anthropomorphic. You know, the T-pillars are, you know, the top of the T is the head,
Yeah,
and the shaft is the body. We know that because we have
the hands.
some pillars with the hands and the arms and the loincloth and the belts. You know, they knew exactly who they were depicting. And if you look at the setup of these special buildings, they are like meeting places. You have like the T-pillars or smaller T-pillars in the walls, set in the walls, sitting on a bench, looking inwards at 2 larger T-pillars or individuals who may have played perhaps a more significant role in society, or mythological beings or mythological ancestors. Ancestors would have played a very important role in upholding some sort of claims as to, you know, how society should be played out. I think, you know, we know that skull cult was a big thing back then. You know that.
Tell me more. Skull cult. That's going to intrigue people.
Well, yeah, it's quite.
Warning that there might be some human remains shown here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we know that at Göbekli Tepe we have fragmented skull remains or fragments of human skulls that do show signs of actually having been worked. So we have like grooves cut in or scratch marks from flint knives. We have drill holes, for example, which probably aren't trepanations, and we think that what happened was when you died back in this period, usually what happened is you were buried underneath your home. So if grandma died or granddad died, you went down into your cellar more or less, and you buried them in the cellar, in a pit. And with some individuals, what happened, especially, we don't know what the criteria were, but with some individuals, the skull was then later exhumed. Sometimes it didn't wait too long, and they had to scrape, you know, whatever was still attached.
So
That's
they have some
where the cut
defleshing
marks.
marks, yeah.
Exactly. And we had then other grooves, perhaps under the chin on one example, and on the top of the skull. They're using cord to decorate them, sort of apply decoration, and then perhaps even hang them up. You know, we know that from sort of ethnographical sort of examples, more recent ethnographical examples. You know, where ancestors are brought out at certain times, you know, mummies, that sort of thing, and for certain celebrations in the year. So I think we're looking at that sort of thing where the ancestors do play a very important role as a means of perhaps sort of supporting the claims or supporting these special or these individuals, these charismatic leaders in a way.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You see this a lot later on, like Ptolemy stealing Alexander's body in order to claim that kind of inheritance and descent. It's not literal descent, but you sort of claim, you know, you, even as field director at Gobekli Tepe, you mentioned, for example, how you started under Klaus Schmidt, right? It's the same kind of idea of claiming authority based on past leaders and past charismatic individuals. And
Exactly.
so, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. This some form of ancestor worship. We see this all over the world at different kinds of sites. So just to return really quickly to these dates, I think somewhere it says 84 different radiocarbon dates have been published at Göbekli Tepe, something around that.
Those are filtered. I mean, we've got a lot of data that obviously can't be used because, you know, we have a problem with bone. We can't date bone because the collagen isn't preserved very well.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So what we're actually looking there, those are filtered dates for Göbekli Tepe. Those are sort of charcoal dates and dates made on short-lived samples like seeds, that sort of thing. So that's what we're using there for those graphs.
And that's going to require very careful excavation to be able to recover seeds, flotation, and things like that. That requires, and that's, you know, huge praise to you guys using 21st century methods to be able to answer these questions everybody's interested in. What is the date of the site? Are some of these dates from underneath these sort of monuments so that we can know the date of the monument? So, you know, some people think that that this all is from what washes in later. It's over the monument, and so it could date even earlier. How would you sort of combat that claim to say, hey, no, this has to date to the, you know, 10th, 9th millennium BC?
Yeah. I mean, regarding dating, I mean, before there were that many radiocarbon dates at the site, Klaus Schmidt was obviously looking at the lithics and the types of arrowheads, for example. You have certain types of arrowheads are characteristic for certain periods in prehistory, depending on where you are. And of course, he was sort of finding that the Byblos points, for example, which are characteristic of the PPNB down there, you know, and of course that was a first indicator for the age of the site, and of course that's still the case. So we've got PPNA type arrowheads, PPNB type arrowheads down there. And of course, with the radiocarbon data, that's sort of, even though the resolution, I mean, the problem is if you're working with charcoal as well, we have to say there's a problem of old wood. Yeah, you might be dating the inside of the tree, not the outside of the tree. You don't know how long the charcoal has been circulating around the site, that sort of thing. There are all sort of things you have to take into consideration. And of course, in the early years, a lot of the radiocarbon data were actually coming from the fill of the building. So really dating the fill and not the actual structures themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, that's clear. So what we've done in recent years, we've actually gone in there and we've taken samples from the mud mortar between the wall stones in the structures themselves to actually date those.
But
So we
yeah.
know from the building archaeology that the buildings were actually multi-phase special. I'm talking about the special buildings now. They were multi-phase special buildings. So they had a larger sort of building in the beginning, and within that they built another one, and within that another one. So we have 3 or 4 different phases, main phases for each of these structures.
Is that what we're looking at with these different colors here?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So what you can see here, this sort of purple color is the older structure, and within that they built another building, which is this one here. Within that, another one, so that the building was getting increasingly smaller over time. And what we did then, we went into the mortar of the walls here, and we took out samples. And some of those samples were from this older second phase, and others were from this younger phase of the building. You can see that we have actually 2 clusters. And one of those clusters is PPNA in date, and the other is PPNB in date. Now, originally, Klaus Schmidt thought that these special buildings were actually PPNA and were, restricted to that period. But we know now that we have actually younger data in the mortar of the walls, which are actually putting these buildings actually also around the mid-9th millennium BC. So what we have here, and funnily enough, or what's really exciting for us, is these older dates come from the older building phase, and these younger dates come from the younger building phase, which is actually telling us that these buildings were actually very long-lived. We're talking centuries here. And
yeah, it's amazing. I cannot imagine using a building for over 1,000 years. I mean, we have very few examples of that today.
Yeah.
Of the building being in use. You know what? Like the Pantheon in Rome could be a good example.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, these buildings were never actually completed in a way. I mean, what we see here is a final phase, obviously here. They were moving pillars around, they were reusing pillars, they were great recyclers. I mean, if you look in the walls of a lot of the buildings, you see old bits of T-pillar, you see bits of grinding stone. So they were, why carve another T-pillar if you've got one there already? So you just drag it out and you sort of move it into the new position. So we're really looking at a building which was very much alive, and they were never actually completed, but they were always in a state of transformation in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's actively being used. It makes a lot of sense in that way. And I have to say, it's good to see that you guys are leaving a bulk for future generations. I work in ancient Athens, for example, and because the entire Acropolis, the entire Athenian Acropolis was excavated down to bedrock, this was before we used modern methods. So we have no radiocarbon, we have no bone, we have no plain pottery. We have almost no pottery at all from the Athenian Acropolis. Yeah, because early excavators didn't find that stuff important. They were interested in the architecture and the sculpture. And so, seeing that you guys have left that kind of bulk there in the middle, I think that's people in the future will thank you.
That's essential that we keep certain sections visible. It also helps understand the site for visitors, but it also helps us. We can always go back, or say later people can go back and actually check what we've done, and I think that's really important. There'll be dating material in there, there'll be the lithics in there, and that's a really important thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, every single site I've been on leaves parts unexcavated. You can even see the stratigraphy in the profile that's right there, and so that's extremely valuable.
We've actually removed this central part, this where it says not excavated. That's actually been removed now because we are actually concentrating on making the site more accessible for visitors
Okay.
and making it more visible and readable in a way. And
Hmm.
as part of that, we have agreed to actually move certain parts and certain bulks, but we have in other areas, of course, the same thing still standing, which we won't remove. But with building, especially under this new shelter that's been constructed
Hmm.
back in 2017, 16, 17, we are trying to make it more accessible and visible to visitors, as I say. And that's what we're actually working on right now.
How does that work at a site like this, sort of the negotiation between thinking through cultural heritage and tourism and research questions? How does that sort of play out at
Well,
a site?
there are three main pillars. We have research, our research questions, we have conservation, and we have obviously making it accessible to visitors. So
Hmm.
those are three important things. If you plan one, you have to think about the other.
Yeah.
So me as an archaeologist and in our team, of course, we always discuss, what we're going to do, how we're going to conserve it, and how the visitor's going to benefit from it.
Yeah.
And that's really important. And that's why we have to take these aspects into consideration. Sometimes we change the pathways for the visitors. At the moment, also, it's quite popular among visitors to actually see the archaeological excavations in process as well, the actual process of excavation. And that's something that we've noticed. Of course, always get a lot of people speaking to us and wanting to
Of
talk to
course.
us. Whether we found this, whether we found that, but they really enjoy it. And actually, we have visitors that stand there for sort of like hours, in fact, just watching or coming back and seeing how we're progressing. So yeah, it's a fine balance, but we have to do it because, of course, if you don't conserve, for example, then you go back next year and the
It's
walls
gone.
tumbled down and it's
Yeah.
gone. Yeah, and of course, with the new shelter, that's helped a great deal. So we can actually do that now. And as soon as we've taken our samples, then we can think about conservation, and then we have the walls repointed to make them more stable, so that they're actually intact for later generation. We make sure that obviously that local people are involved, so these skills that they need to do the repointing, to do the conservation, is in local hands in a way, which is also an important aspect of our work.
Yeah, and I mean, all this, what you're talking about reminds me of, my own excavation history. The very first trench that I supervised as a grad student was at Pompeii. And we were right there where people were going by, and we get all kinds of questions, really good ones, like how do you know which bucket to put the dirt in? Because we all
Yeah,
have different buckets. We're excavating stratigraphically, so you have to make sure that the dirt from one layer is segmented from dirt of another layer, right?
exactly.
And we get
Yeah,
to explain that briefly because we have to work. But
yeah,
it's fun to sort
exactly.
of almost be part of the display.
Yeah, I mean,
And
they see the whole process. I mean, they
yeah.
see us actually excavate, or actually we have it's quite a obviously a long process, as you know. I mean, we start off by recording what we're going to excavate. We have our locus, as we term it. It's photographed, it's measured, with the nivellement, so the elevation, its position in the site, all 3D measured. Photographed, sometimes orthophotos, so a 3D
Mm-hmm.
sort of model. Then we go down 20 centimeters in an artificial spit sometimes, unless we can see something that we need to excavate as a feature. That material then goes off to the sieve, that's sieved and the fines are taken out. And then it goes off to flotation, so that we can get any organic residues, that we can collect those for our archaeobotanists, or small bones, for example.
Mm-hmm.
That all comes out. I mean, for example, until we started doing more flotation, we weren't even aware there were fish bones at the
Huh.
site.
Yeah,
So
of course.
it's really helped us to sort of expand our knowledge in that respect as to what's going on in the environment. And then, of course, after that, the fines are then taken off, and they have to be washed and sorted, documented. Of course, the visitors don't see that because that happens then in the evening in the excavation house. So it's a long day. We start at 6, we work till 2 at the site. Then we head off back to the excavation house, have our breaks and our lunch, have a rest, and then it's all about then the find, processing, documentation. The experts that are there look at the materials. We have to write reports. We have to prepare for the next day, our documentation sheets, etc. So it's a very full-on sort of schedule that we have when we're excavating.
Yeah, and I mean, it's something that I find people don't realize. They sort of go there, they want to see the sculptures, right? These kind of T-pillars. That's what gets everybody speculating. What do they mean? What are they about? And it's sort of like it's all the stuff around them, the dirt, the seeds, the bones, the little tiny stone tools, the kind of stuff that takes hours and hours and hours because we have hundreds of thousands of these to be able to put together the patterns of what's going on, to date them, to understand how people are living. And it's sort of like that's the stuff that doesn't get seen, but that's actually what lets us answer these kind of questions that the public is interested in. You know, I always tell students, don't go into archaeology. It is mind-numbingly boring. It's not like sitting there and wondering about that T-pillar. It's actually sorting through thousands and thousands of lithics.
Exactly.
And so it's very, very slow. And digging, you're digging with a trowel and a brush most of the time, unless you're in just some fill layer. And so it's just like, it's tough for people.
Incredibly hard work. It's tough.
Talking with Dr. Clare, it's clear that the excavations at Göbekli Tepe have to take into account a wide range of factors. On the one hand, there are the research goals of the excavation team. They're fascinated by the site and want to discover everything they can. However, they're not the only people who have a say in the site. As mentioned by Dr. Clare, there's the local community, the Turkish government, and a wide variety of interested people from around the world. And it's not only people today who are interested in Göbekli Tepe. As an important archaeological site, it is our cultural heritage, and it needs to be protected and preserved for future generations. Both as a presentation of the site for tourists or people making documentaries or videos like this on YouTube or whatnot. The standard practice at archaeological sites is to only excavate as much as one has funds to conserve. Conservation is extremely expensive and absolutely necessary. Underground architecture is protected from the elements that erode and weather it away. However, as soon as it is excavated, architecture is exposed to all kinds of damaging processes. So archaeologists never excavate more than we can conserve. Otherwise, it will disappear. Similarly, as a field that has a deep time perspective, archaeologists are concerned about future research. The questions and methods used by the current excavation team, led by Dr. Lee Clare, are very different than those used during the first season of excavation over 30 years ago. Archaeology has changed dramatically. We saw how they recover seeds using flotation, but similarly, the introduction of portable computers, digital cameras, and mapping devices means there's a lot more documentation to take when excavating every layer of sediment or exposing new monumental blocks, or even more humble structures. The Gobekli Tepe team is using today's cutting-edge methods to document their excavation and maximize the amount of information they can get out of every bit excavated. After all, when something is excavated, we destroy the sediment. We remove it from its context. Archaeology is destruction, so we have to document it very carefully. And we also know that methods will improve with time, and that research questions will change based on what is found in these excavations and elsewhere throughout the region. For this reason, archaeologists always leave a witness or unexcavated portions of a site. We've learned this the hard way. As I mentioned, at the Athenian Acropolis, early archaeologists excavated the entire site to bedrock in the 19th century. Their methods were not very good by our modern standards. They were fine for the time, but for what we're interested in, they don't really hold up to snuff. They weren't interested in all the kinds of material that we are today: pottery, animal bones, seeds, or the geological study of dirt. All this stuff was thrown away in the 19th century, unavailable now for people today. So much evidence has been lost because entire sites have been cleared in a hurry. On the other hand, at Pompeii, the site has been undergoing excavation for nearly 300 years. The archaeologists there in the 19th century made a conscious decision to leave large portions of the site unexcavated so that future archaeologists could apply their methods to understand new aspects of the site today. That's why at Pompeii, new amazing discoveries are regularly made that capture the imagination of people around the world. New methods can be applied and new research questions can be answered because of that witness that's left. Gobekli Tepe is so amazing because we can see much of the ceremonial core of the large site that has been excavated in an expert fashion by the Turkish and German-led team of international scholars. The current team continues the work on this ceremonial core, helping us better understand how and when its various parts were constructed, how and when it was abandoned, and who used it. And equally important, they are also excavating the more modest structures around the ceremonial core, so we can see how people lived and worked at this fascinating Stone Age settlement. You know, I've seen on social media recently this kind of conversation, the abandonment of the site, right? And so how do you answer that question if you don't actually approach it in a geologically, geoarchaeologically sound way to be able
Exactly.
to understand how it's filled in? You have a slide on this. Let me share it. On sort of, is this an intentional burial to preserve it for the
Yeah.
future? Is it slope erosion? Is it a combination of both? And so what's your thoughts on this? This is something I think that's been more
Yeah.
published on
I
really
mean,
recently.
yeah, I mean, this is something that we've noticed in the past few years, in fact. And what we can see here, or what we're seeing from our, reinvestigation of the stratigraphy and of the filling process of these buildings, we've come to the conclusion now that because, of course, these special buildings at the bottom here, what we can't see here is that we have a very steep slope. I mean, you can see it perhaps in this section here. It is quite steep. And of course, we now know that the special buildings were actually contemporaneous, in fact, with the domestic structures here on the slope. And we know we still have problems today with erosion at the site. And at the time in the Neolithic, they had the same problem. They're actually constructing terrace walls, in fact, trying to keep the slope pressure in check. But at some point, perhaps after heavy rainfall or an earthquake or a combination of the two, what happened is these slopes gave way and there was a tremendous slope slide, and which actually led to the inundation with sediment, with the structures from the slope into these special buildings. And of course, that explains where the material is coming from.
Yeah.
Klaus Schmidt always thought, oh, they're carrying it in and burying the buildings intentionally. But where are they carrying it from? He never knew. He couldn't, he didn't know. And of course, when you're looking at the fill of these special buildings now, you see all the debris, you see the fragmented animal bones, the fragmented human bones, which are obviously disturbed sort of refuse pits and burials that just come down the slope, been churned up and deposited in these buildings. That said, of course, there is evidence also from other sites of buildings that have been intentionally destroyed, perhaps through fire or intentionally buried. At Karahan Tepe, for example, there is evidence, in fact, that some of the special buildings there, or parts of them, were probably intentionally buried because they have sterile soil in them. So each building has to be taken in itself, for itself in a way, and each building looked at very carefully, the stratigraphy of the fill, to actually sort of approach each one individually. But at least for the case of building D, probably building C and building B, we have good evidence that there was a slope slide event or a series of events that led to the inundation of these buildings, and of course their good preservation. And in fact, between some of these layers, if you dig carefully, you actually find then sort of walking areas, trampled areas, where that perhaps sort of emerged during the interim periods between these slope slide events, where they were sort of walking across and perhaps still using the building in a way.
And such an ephemeral surface. I mean, it really goes to show that's kudos to you guys. Finding that while excavating is not very easy, and so it requires very
The best thing
meticulous
actually,
work.
if I can interrupt you, last
Yeah.
year in 2023, we were actually lucky enough, because we were going at this at a slow pace, just above the floor of Building D, we actually found the negatives of wooden beams from the roof, which
Ooh.
is a really cool thing. I mean, we had like it was quite a few meters long, and they were crossed like this. Of course, the wood structure, the wood had obviously disappeared over the millennia, but it left the negative in the rubble. So it was
Interesting. So
fantastic.
let's move to some of these kind of conspiracy-ish theories, and in fact, let's think about that. There's this idea that there's these handbags, and I believe you guys have always claimed that that's actually representing the pillars and the roof, right?
Yeah,
And so this new find would help demonstrate that. Am I correct?
exactly. We've also got, I mean, with the handbags, of course, it's sort of a rounded roof. And a few years back, we did have actually, or it's still at the site, it's not actually visible to the public, it's the northwestern part of the site, which will be open to the public at some point when excavations there have reached a certain state. It's still very preliminary at the moment. But in that area, we had a pit, a large, perhaps even a cistern, a very deep carved pit into the bedrock, 8 meters in diameter, 3 meters deep. And above, on the edge of the pit, we have 3 or 4 courses of corbelled roofing. So in
Hmm.
fact, we
I
may
can see
actually
that.
have corbelling, which would then explain this rounded shape of the so-called handbags. So we do think that these handbags that we see on that pillar that you're talking about are in fact depictions of the special buildings or buildings or structures at Göbekli Tepe.
Very, very cool. That's what you want to find. You have a
Yeah.
hypothesis, you test it, you find the response, and boom, that's archaeology as a science right there. What about the erosion? So another thing that's come up on Twitter lately is kind of these olive trees that have been
Mm,
planted. I mean, from looking at them, I would think that having olive trees planting would help limit erosion. You know, sort of trees trap soil on different sites.
yeah,
I've seen trees there to help limit
yeah,
erosion, provide shade,
sure.
etc.
I mean, there's a bit of a long story to these trees. I mean, the trees were actually planted back in 2006, I believe. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, that was before the site was actually purchased by the Turkish state. And before that, of course, it was farmland. Yeah, and the
Yeah.
farmers, they were farming it. And in 2006, they planted these olive trees, which are still there today. Um, of course, they do, in a way, help hold the soil. Um, but they're being constantly monitored to make sure that they're not causing damage
Okay.
to the underlying features. And of course, a few have been removed in the course of like the construction of the shelters.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in a way, they also have another important function. They're actually still a connection for the local population to the site because
Mm-hmm.
they planted those trees. And of course, the archaeologists, the Turkish state, the tourists, we're not the only stakeholders here. It's the local population as well. They
Of course.
identify with the site very much still today, even though it's no longer in their possession legally. They still have this sort of very much conscious awareness of the site as having belonged to them. And this is another way of their connection. They still go up and harvest the olives, for
Ah,
example.
that's cool.
They go in and they harvest the grass, for example, for their animals, because of course the site's now protected. There's a fence around it, but the grass is, obviously in the springtime it's very green, lush, and there's lots of grass there. And they actually come in and they harvest by hand the grass, and I take it back to the animals in the village, and the olives as well. They're harvested by them as well. So it's it's a very sort of the network at Göbekli Tepe. It's not that straightforward. There are lots of different so-called stakeholders. There are there's the local population. There's people that work there. There's the scientists. There's the tourists. There's the ministry. The museum. There are so many people involved. The UNESCO.
Mm-hmm.
ICOMOS, and of course everyone. We all work together, of course. We have meetings, we talk to one another. Communication is essential, and that's the way it's played out. I mean, we have to make sure that everyone in a way is happy with what's going on.
I agree. Yeah, it's very difficult to negotiate those kind of things, but it's also very fruitful. You get all these different perspectives on how to manage an archaeological site so that it's useful and important to all these different kinds of people to think through how to manage that. And yeah, I think that that's how archaeology is. Archaeology should be for everybody. We can't just sort of excavate and publish in a journal where nobody sees it.
Exactly.
We need to make it accessible to tourists that come. It needs to be accessible to locals that have a connection to it. And so, yeah, this is extremely important. It's not just for one group of people at all.
Exactly.
It's for everybody. Yeah. So on that note, I mean, I don't know. Look, as somebody who's just started thinking about public communication with archaeology and stuff like that, Gobekli Tepe is just everywhere. People around the world seem to somehow be obsessed with it, despite the fact that there's so many other amazing sites as well. What are your thoughts on that? Why is
Why is
Gobekli
it so
Tepe such a
popular?
lightning rod?
Um, I think there's a number of factors. I think firstly, the geography, where it's located. I mean, southeastern Turkey, Şanlıurfa province. In fact, last year, the OIC, which is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, named Şanlıurfa their City of the Year. So
Okay.
it was, there's a lot of religious tourism going on in Şanlıurfa, for example. And that's what I mean by the geography. It's in an area which is highly sort of ritually or religiously charged in a way.
Yeah.
Then we have the monumentality of the site and its uniqueness in a way, or no longer uniqueness, but of course there are other sites now. But at the time, the uniqueness of the site with these T-pillars. And we have the research history where, Klaus Schmidt, spoke or referred to these buildings as temples. He also used a lot of Christian sort of terminology, like altars and stoa for the garments, and
Huh.
referred to clergy and that sort of thing. So that fits in with this sort of religious aspect of the region. And that's then picked up, obviously, by the media and by marketing. And I think, and of course now social media. And I think this whole ritual, religious sort of background, its location, its geography, its proximity to Mount Ararat with the Noah's Ark story narrative, it all plays a part. And I think it is that combination of different factors that has really made the site a bit of a hub for anyone that's interested in religion or is religious, the history of religion, or any of these sort of alternative or sort of esoteric lines of thought.
And so, what do you think is our role in this? I mean, you mentioned that some of this comes out of the language that Klaus Schmidt used. I
Mm.
mean, so we need to be very cognizant of how we refer to things in public,
Yeah,
is what I'm gathering.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's why I say special buildings, not temples. That's why I say, ritual experts instead of, clergy. I try and make my language more neutral when I'm talking about the site, so as not
Mhm.
to raise those sort of comparisons in people's minds with sort of more modern ways of thinking.
But at the same time, you're trying to solve mysteries,
Sure,
and we are trying to interest people in the site. So we need to
sure.
somehow strike that kind of balance
Yeah,
in.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I see the people that come to visit the site. I mean, we have religious groups, Islamic groups of Muslims, of Christians. We have people singing psalms at the top of the site sometimes. I mean, there is actually one regulation: you can do what you want at the site, as long as you don't build up sort of an altar or use sort of this sort of thing. It's we get people at the wish tree putting their hands on the tree and meditating. We get people looking for ley lines, etc. we have lots of different visitors, and I'm you know, I always communicate, well, if I have time, you know, I communicate with pagans and with Christians, and you know, I don't mind who I speak to, but of course I always sort of speak to them in an archaeological way, and they're always very happy to know that, you know, the archaeologists are also open to discussion in a way. Of course, I have my data, I have my narrative, they have their narrative, wherever that may come from, but who am I to say that they're wrong? Okay, I mean, they can think really what they want to think, what makes them feel comfortable. But at the same time, of course, there are more dangerous tendencies when these sort of things take a more sort of racist sort of perspective and that sort of thing. You know, that's where where my hackles do go up in a way.
Yeah, we have to be very careful about that and combat that, I suppose. By the way, a quick break from our sponsors. Oh, that's us. Okay, so yeah, this channel is Archaeology with Flint Dibble, and I'm Flint. I'm an archaeologist with decades of experience in the field, lab, and at the podium. I'm here to pull back the curtain on the field of archaeology and provide a behind-the-scenes look at 21st century methods, what we do, how we do it, and why it matters today. So smash that like, subscribe, and share button, and be sure to chip me a tip with a super thanks or a membership for some behind-the-scenes perks. Okay, enough of a self-promo. Back to Dr. Lee Clare and Göbekli Tepe. So let's think about what's coming up and what you guys are doing right now at the site. You sent me some slides, I think, of a good example of what to me is it shows how you guys document as you excavate it. Would this be a good example, the slab covered pit in Special Building D?
Oh yeah, you can show that.
Yeah,
That's pretty exciting.
Go up here. So let's walk us through sort of what you guys are, how you're documenting this, and
Yeah.
what it means, and why it's so important to document in such a careful, meticulous fashion. Yeah.
So this is special building D, the western side of it. You can see over here on the right hand side. This block here was removed, and beneath this block we found this pit here. Which we then excavated back in 2022.
Okay.
Now this pit really sort of was special in a way for us when we found it, because actually around the edges of it we had sort of some red coloring, so some ochre coloring, and this sort of coloring is usually associated also with sort of ritual or burial sometimes. Right back from the Middle Paleolithic we have like ochre being used in sort of ritual or burial contexts, and then we had this slab, and it was carefully sort of pinned down by these wedges, and it was like, well, this is really exciting. And actually next to this, and here is actually an incised eye shape in the rock surface on the floor of the building. We get these I or H shapes on the pillars and on some small finds. We don't know what they mean, but it could be like a double T pillar in a way. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's obviously a symbol that had some significance for people at the time. So we had this coloring around the edges of the pit. We had this incised eye symbol next to it. And it was like, what have we got here? I mean, we've always been looking for burials in the special buildings. So anthropologist was there at the time, human anthropologist, Julia Greski, and we decided then to actually excavate this in 2022. It was carefully documented, it was scanned, measured, you know,
and ortho photos like this, so that people
photos
know,
like this
are very carefully made so that you can measure off them.
Exactly, and these can be turned and modeled, and you know, we can look at everything once again, even post excavation. So we removed the slab, and underneath, unfortunately, there wasn't any burial or skull cache or anything like that. It was just them ironing out some sort of probably a fault in the natural bedrock, because the bedrock of these buildings is carefully smoothed and is actually the floor of these structures. So they're probably just sort of ironing that out in a way and repairing that. But at the same time, it does appear to have some sort of special purpose because of the ochre, because of this symbol next to it. But of course, we don't have
Was
any idea
anything
what
in
that
it at
could have
all?
been.
Any artifacts
It was
or?
actually quite empty, apart from one very
Huh.
small flint blade. But of course, all that material went to sieving. We had samples taken. Phytoliths, for example, were taken from the base of the pit. Soil samples are still stored with us in the excavation house, so they can be restudied. We have flotation done, and you know, it was looked at in depth way, obviously.
Yeah, and it makes sense. You find something like that, you need to be prepared for finding other very careful things in there, and sometimes you don't. That's
Yeah.
that's life too. Negative evidence is
Exactly.
evidence.
Videos were taken while we were doing it. So I mean, we try and sort of, you know, every scenario, we try and back everything up and make sure that we can actually go back and see the whole process from the very beginning again, in case something's not clear. For example, when we're writing it up or doing the report, so we can go back and sort of check what we're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, so you guys have found a few burials. Just to note, there'll be human
Mm.
remains for a second. And so that's what you want to be prepared for, is in case you end up finding stuff like this. This was in just a drainage channel,
Yeah,
these burials. So are
this
these
is
intentional interments or?
these are intentional interments. I mean, this is a burial that was discovered in a drainage channel. Of course, when the new shelters, the protective shelters were constructed, we had to dig a small trench for a drainage channel to drain off the rainwater. And we actually cut in or cut a rectangular building from the PPNB. So we're looking about 8,500 BC here, mid-9th million BC. And as luck would have it, within the floor of that building, a plaster floor, there was sort of a kidney-shaped pit. And kidney-shaped pits of human size are always quite a promising thing to have. And in we went, and yes, it turned out to be a burial of at least 3 individuals, perhaps even a 4th individual.
Mhm.
It was disturbed in prehistory. The skull has been moved up to one end, and some long bones, also in articulation, were found pushed to the other ends and the sides of the pit. Within the pit itself, there were a couple of flint blades found. So obviously, it gives us an impression of sort of secondary burial rites going on. People were being buried, they were going back in, they were re-exhuming parts of the body, long bones perhaps, to rebury elsewhere, or skulls. And this is what we have then in as a feature in this rectangular building or trapezoid building from the PPNB. And of
Hmm.
course, you know, the bones are then studied, and we have a bit of information about who was buried there, female, male, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
and any health conditions that may have had, if we're lucky, and teeth. You know, dental wear, that sort of thing, is all important stuff for reconstructing this community that was living there.
So let's think about these people then. I guess a lot of the recent excavations have also focused less in the special areas, but also in sort of domestic structures, right?
Mhm.
The
That's
people
right.
that are living there seasonally. Okay.
Or permanently. I mean, this is a thing in the course of the occupation of the site, that sort of sedentism increases. And I think
Hmm.
at least in the probably in the late PPNA and definitely in the early PPNB, we're looking at a sedentary, a fixed village, in fact, where people were obviously they were still very much mobile, they were still hunting and gathering, but a certain part of the population was actually staying at Göbekli Tepe on a permanent basis, I think.
Really? Okay. So what I'd read about seasonality was a lot of the food was coming from certain seasons of the year. So is there evidence then that they're staying there year round?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, obviously we have, um, for example, we excavated an area with PPNA domestic structures, and we have there, obviously, the resolution of the radiocarbon dates can't give us, you know, what the answer we want. But we do have structures that were definitely PPNA, where we have multiple floors being renewed in the micro sort of stratigraphy of the floor of the building. We see the floor of the building being cleaned and renewed, and multiple sequences of very thin layers of floor in those structures. I mean, that's obviously no evidence or conclusive evidence that they were there permanently. But in the PPNB, we do have these rectangular structures, there are adjoining structures, they're a lot more solid. I mean, if we look at these structures, we're talking about a population that could have been in the hundreds, in fact. I mean, I don't like to give a number as to how many people were living there at the time, but of course, you know, you're not going to be moving around with a couple of hundred people from place to place. And of course, in the vicinity of these sites, we have hunting traps, so-called desert kites, where there were sort of mass hunting in an industrial way. In fact, the gazelle, which were passing through the area, there's lots of those. None has been excavated as far as I know, but many are known from surface survey, and there have been the occasional finds of like Byblos points, as things like typical PPNB, 9th millennium BC lithics coming from these sites. So a lot of them were probably actually in use during the occupation sequence of Karahan Tepe, of Göbekli Tepe, and all the other sites. And of course, you know, this really points to sort of this sedentary population. And of course, storage is obviously a significant question, obviously, in this regard, because of course, if you're, you know, if you're harvesting the animals and the plants, such excesses, then you have to store it. We've got big storage vessels, you know, that can't be transported, grinding stones that can't be transported easily. So we're literally looking, it must be a sedentary population at this time.
What kind of storage vessels? What are they made from? Because there's no pottery.
Limestone,
Okay,
big
so they're
limestone, you know, vats and vessels, troughs.
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I guess you have some pictures with some pillars in these domestic structures. So there's this relationship between sort of domestic structures and I guess
Yeah.
this monumentality, though at a smaller scale.
This is quite interesting. I mean, I think what we're seeing here, to put it sort of in a nutshell, I think some of the buildings don't have T-pillars, these domestic structures. I mean, a lot of these rectangular trapezoid structures we now actually think of as domestic because, you know, they're giving that evidence. We're having like grinding stones falling down from the upper story. We're having really in situ grinding stones actually found in the floors of the building. Vessels, storage vessels, these limestone vessels that I just mentioned, are really large ones. But some of them actually have T-pillars. Now you've got to imagine that this is probably the cellars of these buildings. There probably was another story above this. There's good evidence for that in the building archaeology, and some of them actually have benches and a pillar or two in them. Now the question is here, why? Why do some? Why do you know have them and others don't? Firstly, of course, there's a very pragmatic reason that they help support the roof or the upper floor of these buildings. Secondly, I think there's a more sort of ritual or religious sort of explanation to them as well. And I think what we're seeing is in the course of the history of the site, we're seeing the communal buildings perhaps becoming less popular or falling out of use after, say, the slides or whatever, and perhaps this ritual thing moving into the domestic sphere. So, and we see it much later on, I say much later, a couple of thousand years later, at Çatalhöyük, where you have the burials in the buildings, you have the areas reserved for certain ritual aspects. And I think we're seeing that already at Göbekli Tepe. We're seeing this move away from the communal buildings to a more sort of rituals within the frame of the family, and that's something that then carries on into the late Neolithic, because of course after Göbekli Tepe, these big communal buildings, we don't see them anymore, they disappear, and we don't have anything comparable until like the Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Age. You know, these big monumental buildings, they're gone, and a lot of this sort of ritual sphere, the ritual activities are taking place in the domestic frame.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think on this note, like, let's think about what's relevant for today. A lot of your research is focused on how this sort of change in culture relates to sort of climate change and stuff like that. We'll also ask about future plans, but do you want to end by with the narrative of how does climate change impact people's lives in this sort of early period? They're living very different lives from ours. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the climate change at the beginning of Göbekli Tepe, of course, we're in the mid-10th millennium BC. This is the beginning of the Holocene. So we're going from the Younger Dryas, when it was cooler and drier, to a wetter climate. So we would have had like the return of sort of foresty areas. I mean, the vegetation at Göbekli Tepe, of course, we know this from the archaeobotany studies, botanical studies. We know it was sort of a loose forest area with like
Hmm.
wild almond trees and oak trees, where areas where we're having the fish coming from, and areas where wild boar and aurochs were probably grazing. They needed more wetter conditions
So a
and so on.
very
So
different landscape than
a
today.
very different landscape
Yeah.
to the cultural landscape we have today. And of course, in the course of in the early Holocene, it was probably wetter even than it is today. And this is why, this sort of climate may have had a problem with the erosion, lead to problems with the erosion, because of course the excess or the extra rainfall would have made the earth
Hmm.
heavier. And of course, the slopes are increasingly unstable. I mean, that's perhaps one way that climate could have impacted the erosion of the site in a way.
Huh.
The climate played a very big role, and of course, the environment. The climate proxy evidence for this part of the country, southeastern Turkey, isn't that much at the moment. We don't have any
Okay.
local proxies
So you're
because
relying on
climate is
regional
very
Eastern Mediterranean.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
climate is very regional. We're still looking very much at the big proxies like Lake Van towards the east, the Dead Sea, climate proxies from the Mediterranean, East Mediterranean, that sort of area, Greece and the lakes in central Anatolia. But locally in Sanliurfa, there's very little evidence or climate proxies that we actually can use to reconstruct climate. So we're very much relying on our archaeobotanical results.
Yeah. That makes a lot of
Um,
sense.
so we hope that in the future that's going to change, that we're going to have more work invested in the paleoclimate, paleoenvironment of the region. But of course, the climate and the environment played a very big role in how the site was used, how it probably emerged in the first place, and why it was actually abandoned.
Yeah, and especially with cultural changes in the larger region, you see elsewhere domestication happening, and that many people have linked that to sort of climate change for
Yeah,
various reasons. And so also the climate at the time made this an attractive location because it meant
exactly.
gazelle moving through, wild wheat to harvest, and then
Yeah,
other kinds of that forest microbiome that you're talking about,
yeah.
loose forest. Okay, that's really interesting, and I think it's important that we understand how that plays a part. So what do we see in the future? What are you guys excavating this season?
Right, this season we're back in the main excavation area, so if the tourists are down there, or if you're visiting the site, please come and say hello. We're going to be under the big white shelter. We're actually working now in building B.
Hmm.
So we're checking also again the stratigraphy of the fill of the building carefully. So we're doing excavations in the north, because of course excavations started there back under Klaus Schmidt, and now we have the opportunity to go in there again and to literally look at what he did, do some fresh excavations in there, and at the same time make the structure more visible for the public. And after that, of course, conservation will be done so that we can keep it for
It
the next,
survives, yeah.
it survives in the future. And that's the main part of our work there at the moment. So it'd be building B. We're also going to be taking a look at some deep soundings that were excavated when we did the preparation for the shelter construction at the site. So we want to check the stratigraphy again of the site, because in these areas where we actually had the shelter, the shelter has legs and they go
Of
into
course.
the ground, they're anchored. We had to remove the archaeology from those areas, obviously before that was done. And so we have a stratigraphy for the entire sequence of the mound. So we're going to be looking at that again, doing some more documentation of that. We're going to be doing some
And
conservation.
and notably down through sterile soil even, right? And so that's some
Um, we don't reach sterile, we reach the plateau. The natural plateau is
that's
underneath.
what I mean.
So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So yeah, so you're actually down to
right down to
bedrock.
the very bottom, right down to
Yeah,
bedrock.
yeah. That's
Or
important.
or down to Serra, yeah.
It's not like you assume there's nothing below PPNA.
So we'll be looking at that again. We'll be looking for more radiocarbon samples. We'll be also doing some conservation work in Building C to preserve that structure, but also beforehand taking some samples from the mortar so we can do some more radiocarbon dating to get some dates then for the different phases of that structure. Yeah, so we've got a bit of a busy program.
Yeah,
We've
sounds
got
that
a
way.
few film teams coming down as well that need to be obviously taken care of.
So how do you hide stuff from the film teams, the stuff that like the secrets that archaeologists keep? Do you sort of like
We
you
can't
sort of
hide anything.
walkie-talkie around and say, all right, everybody cover this up, a film team's coming,
Yeah,
or
quick, cover it up. No, I mean, the thing is, of course, some areas are out of bounds for, you know, regular tourists. If we do have a film team, then I usually take them to the areas that they want to see, or we have a meeting beforehand and we tour the entire site so they can get an impression of what's going on so that they can choose what they want to film. But there are no secrets, nothing being hidden, the site.
no. You
The only
guys have done
person
an
that
amazing job on public outreach with the Tepe Telegram sites and the different ways that you guys have worked to share this. I mean, heck, you know, Gobekli Tepe is sometimes on the cover of archaeology textbooks. Like this is not a
yeah,
secret in any way. It's a front and center of what people
yeah,
think about. Yeah. So,
exactly.
all
Exactly.
right.
I'm always happy to show people around and you know, like I said, it's not just for us, it's for everyone. And you know, if I have the chance to take people around, you know, have the chance to show them the areas that are off limits, I like to do that. But obviously, it's not always available, you know, possible with our time schedule. Yeah, we're not hiding anything.
No, no, of course not. Any last shout outs or thanks or anything you want to say?
Of course, thanks to the excavation director, to Professor Necmi Kabul from the University of Istanbul, all the colleagues that work at the site in the team, of course. I also have to thank, obviously, the Ministry of Culture of Turkey that we're allowed to work at the site every year, to the Sanliurfa Museum. I mean, there are so many people. I've probably forgotten lots of people, but I think it's important to mention those. And of course, the German Research Foundation for funding our research.
Okay, so that's good. I think we have everybody listed, and
I hope so.
you've forgotten. You know,
If
you
not, let me
forgot the
know.
World Economic Forum, Lee.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm sorry about that. No. How
How
could
could you
I?
forget that? I
How
mean, you
could I
know.
forget them? No, no.
Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me.
Well, thank you for having me. It's
You
been
guys are
great.
doing a stellar job, and I've never
Thank you very
been
much.
there. I want to come visit at some
Oh, you must
point,
come.
and
Yeah.
yeah,
Look forward to seeing you there.
yeah, that would be fun. All right.
Okay.
Well, there you have it, the cutting edge of what's happening today at Gobekli Tepe. Excavations are happening right now, in fact. I can't wait to see what they find. Thanks especially to Dr. Lee Clare and all the researchers, scholars, students, and volunteers who have worked hard to make Gobekli Tepe the fascinating site that we all know and love today. Tell me what you think in a comment below. Peace out.